February 1st, 1942. The Western Pacific, before dawn. The sea is calm, almost polished. A low swell lifts steel hulls without sound. Engines turn at reduced revolutions. The vibration felt more than heard. On the bridges of Japanese warships, officers watch the horizon through cold air that smells faintly of oil and salt. Night is loosening its grip, minute by minute. They believe they are early. Ahead of schedule. Pearl Harbor lies weeks behind them now. Burned, silent, still repairing its wounds. In Tokyo, the timetable says the Americans should still be stunned, still reorganizing, still arguing over what comes next. The enemy, according to the plan, does not yet have the time to think clearly, let alone strike back. Below decks, sailors move quietly. Ammunition is secured. Aircraft are chained to decks slick with dew. No alarms sound. No evasive maneuvers are ordered. There is no sense of urgency, only momentum. Far across the water, beyond the curve of the earth, American ships are already moving. Not in strength, not in comfort, but with intent. Crews are operating on little sleep. Intelligence reports are incomplete. Orders are thin, but engines are warm, and flight decks are active. Neither side can see the other yet. Neither fully understands what the next hours will demand. The Japanese advance continues under the assumption that time itself is on their side, that preparation belongs to the future, not the present. The ocean remains indifferent. History, for a brief moment longer, holds its breath. The belief that the United States had no time to prepare did not come from carelessness. It was constructed carefully, over years, inside briefing rooms and war colleges, shaped by doctrine, precedent, and selective memory. By the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already decided how a war against the United States would unfold. It would not be a prolonged struggle. It could not be. Japan's industrial base, fuel reserves, and access to raw materials were finite. Any conflict with an industrial power like the United States had to be decided early, violently, and at sea. This conviction produced a doctrine built around decisive tempo. Japanese planners believed the opening phase of war would determine everything that followed. If the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be crippled at the outset, American morale would fracture, political pressure would rise, and Washington would negotiate before its full strength could be brought to bear. Time, in this model, was a weapon, one Japan intended to seize and exhaust before the United States could react. Pearl Harbor was not designed to win the war. It was designed to buy time. In Tokyo, naval war games reinforced this assumption. Simulations conducted throughout the 1930s repeatedly showed American forces advancing slowly across the Pacific, rebuilding methodically, constrained by distance and democratic debate. In these exercises, Japanese forces achieved early victories, established fortified perimeters, and then forced a decisive fleet engagement under favorable conditions. The exercises almost always ended the same way. Japan struck first, seized the initiative, and dictated the pace. What these games rarely modeled accurately was American adaptation. The United States was treated as a static opponent, predictable, cautious, bound by procedure. Its industrial capacity was acknowledged, but its speed was underestimated. American carriers were expected to remain defensive. Repairs were assumed to take months. New construction was measured in years. This misjudgment hardened into institutional confidence. By 1941, Japanese naval intelligence assessed that even if war began immediately, the United States would require at least 6 months to regain operational coherence in the Pacific. Carrier task forces, they believed, would be hesitant to operate aggressively without battleship support. Aircrews would need retraining. Command relationships would take time to stabilize. Time, again, was assumed to belong to Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood the danger of this thinking. He warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but beyond that, he could offer no assurance of victory. His warnings were not about tactics, but about duration. A short war favored Japan. A long war favored the United States absolutely. Yet Yamamoto's solution still accepted the premise of compressed time. The answer was not restraint, it was speed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was followed immediately by a cascade of offensives: the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies. Japanese forces advanced along a vast arc, striking faster than most Allied commanders believed possible. Each success reinforced the belief that the enemy was off balance, reacting late, always a step behind. Reports flowing back to Tokyo seemed to confirm it. American airfields fell. Ships were sunk at anchor. Garrison forces surrendered after short resistance. In Japanese operational summaries, phrases repeated themselves: enemy disorganized, enemy retreating, enemy unprepared. What those reports did not capture was what could not be seen from the front lines. They did not measure how quickly American command structures were hardening. They did not reflect emergency decisions made in Washington within hours, not weeks. They did not account for carrier commanders operating outside established doctrine because doctrine no longer applied. Most critically, they misunderstood American time. To Japanese planners, time was linear, a sequence of steps that had to be completed in order. Mobilization followed debate. Training followed mobilization. Action followed training. This was how war had unfolded for the United States in 1917. But 1941 was not 1917. When Japanese task forces moved deeper into the Pacific in early 1942, they did so under a powerful assumption: that the enemy was still assembling the pieces, still learning how to fight, still too early in the process to interfere meaningfully. The ocean ahead appeared open. The calendar appeared forgiving. What Japanese doctrine did not anticipate was an opponent willing to operate while incomplete, accepting risk, acting before preparation felt sufficient, moving not when ready, but when necessary. That reality was already forming beyond the horizon, and it was closing fast. December 7, 1941 did not paralyze the United States. It compressed it. In the hours after Pearl Harbor, the American Pacific Fleet was wounded, but it was not inert. Smoke still rose from Battleship Row when orders began moving outward: short, incomplete, urgent. There was no time to rebuild structures. Existing ones were forced to bend. What survived the attack mattered more than what was lost. The aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, were not in port. This was not foresight, it was coincidence. But coincidence reshaped the war. With the battleship line shattered, carriers became the only instruments capable of immediate action. Doctrine shifted not by committee, but by necessity. Within days, carrier task forces were already at sea. American commanders did not believe they were ready. They knew they were exposed. Fuel was limited. Intelligence was fragmented. Aircrews were short of combat experience. But inactivity was considered more dangerous than risk. The Pacific was too large, the enemy moving too fast, to wait for perfection. In Washington, emergency authority flowed downward. Production schedules were rewritten. Repair priorities were triaged with brutal clarity. Ships that could float were sent back out. Ships that could not were cannibalized to save others. There was no expectation of elegance, only urgency. American time no longer moved in phases. It moved in overlaps. Training continued while operations began. Doctrine evolved during contact. Mistakes were corrected in motion, not in classrooms. Carrier commanders, men like William Halsey and Frank Jack Fletcher, were given latitude they would never have enjoyed in peacetime. Communications were imperfect. Orders were often broad. The expectation was no longer control, it was initiative. This was not a refined system. It was a living one. Industrial capacity, long discussed in abstract, began producing immediate effects. Aircraft losses were replaced faster than anticipated. Damaged carriers were repaired in weeks instead of months. Yard workers operated around the clock. Civilian production lines converted with startling speed, aided by plans drafted years earlier but never tested at scale. Japanese intelligence observed these developments, but misunderstood them. Reports acknowledged American sorties. They noted carrier raids on the Marshalls and Gilberts in early 1942. These were interpreted as morale operations, symbolic gestures meant to reassure a shaken public. They were not seen as indicators of operational confidence. What those raids actually revealed was something more dangerous. American forces were already probing, already measuring response times, already learning how Japanese air defenses reacted. Each small strike returned data, range estimates, interception delays, command response patterns. The Americans were not stalling. They were calibrating. On the tactical level, crews adapted rapidly. Pilots flew with incomplete charts. Navigators worked from outdated maps. Radar operators learned under pressure, distinguishing false contacts from real ones while at sea. Commanders absorbed losses without waiting for permission to retreat. Psychologically, the shock of Pearl Harbor produced clarity rather than confusion. The ambiguity that had restrained American policy vanished overnight. The war's scope was understood instantly. There was no debate over commitment. The only uncertainty was method. This mattered deeply. Japanese planners expected an enemy slowed by politics, distracted by competing priorities, hesitant to gamble. Instead, they encountered one willing to operate on partial information, to absorb early losses, and to strike before preparation felt comfortable. Time, which Japan believed it had seized, was already slipping. By late January 1942, American carrier groups were operating independently, coordinating across vast distances with minimal communication. Their presence was intermittent, unpredictable, and increasingly aggressive. They did not mass strength yet, but they denied Japan something just as important: predictability. The Japanese advance continued according to schedule, but the environment around it was changing. The Americans were not rebuilding behind the front. They were already inside the operational space, testing, adjusting, interfering. Two timelines were now running simultaneously. One was planned, measured, and confident. The other was improvised, accelerating, and increasingly dangerous. They were moving toward the same point. Angles, Section 11. Human cost. Preparation is not only a matter of equipment or doctrine. It is carried in bodies. For American crews in the early months of 1942, time collapsed into continuous wakefulness. Sailors slept in short rotations, often in full gear. Pilots lived beside their aircraft, eating where they stood, briefing while engines warmed. The war had begun without a transition period. There was no emotional distance between shock and responsibility. Many of these men had joined the Navy during peacetime. Their training emphasized procedure, not improvisation. Now, decisions arrived faster than instructions. Fatigue accumulated without permission. Mistakes were absorbed silently, corrected immediately, and rarely discussed. Losses were personal and immediate. Aircraft that failed to return were noticed not in reports, but in empty spaces on crowded decks. There were no ceremonies. There was rarely confirmation. Names disappeared into routine. Japanese crews, advancing under a sense of momentum, experienced a different pressure. Their belief in preparation, careful planning, rehearsed execution, created an expectation of control. When operations unfolded smoothly, confidence hardened. When they did not, stress spiked sharply. The cost was not yet counted in large casualty numbers. It was measured in strain, hands shaking during refueling, voices clipped on command circuits, men watching horizons longer than necessary. Both sides carried exhaustion, but only one side believed it should not yet be necessary. That difference mattered. 2. Tactical reality. Japanese tactics in early 1942 were precise, layered, and optimized for offensive tempo. Carrier air groups trained extensively for coordinated strikes. Surface units moved with discipline. Operations were synchronized according to detailed timetables. This system rewarded preparation and punished deviation. American tactics, by contrast, were incomplete. Carrier doctrine was still evolving. Coordination between air, surface, and submarine forces was uneven. Communication gaps were frequent. But this lack of rigidity allowed rapid adjustment. American task forces altered courses abruptly, operated independently, and accepted partial information as sufficient. They did not wait to assemble ideal formations. They attacked when windows opened, not when conditions stabilized. In encounters where Japanese forces expected uncontested movement, American presence introduced friction. Timetables slipped. Air patrols were extended. Fuel consumption increased. Each adjustment created vulnerability. Tactically, these disruptions were minor. Strategically, they accumulated. Japanese commanders began allocating resources earlier than planned. Combat air patrols launched sooner, escorts tightened, reserves repositioned. These were rational responses, but they eroded the assumption that the operational environment would remain permissive. The battlefield was no longer empty. 3. Technological limitations. Technology did not favor either side absolutely in early 1942. It favored adaptation. Japanese aircraft were longer-ranged and highly maneuverable. Their pilots were experienced. Their torpedoes were superior. But Japanese doctrine relied heavily on visual detection and precise timing. Radar was limited and not yet integrated deeply into fleet operations. American forces, though flying less refined aircraft, were rapidly incorporating radar into tactical decision-making. Early sets were unreliable, their interpretations inconsistent. But they extended awareness beyond the horizon, and awareness changed behavior. Radar contacts prompted course changes. They bought minutes. They altered launch timing. Even when imperfect, they disrupted Japanese expectations of surprise. Technology, in this phase, was not about superiority. It was about denying certainty. Each side carried strengths the other underestimated. But only one side assumed the war would wait for readiness to arrive. That assumption was already unraveling. Engels, Section 24. Leadership Decisions. Leadership in early 1942 was defined less by vision than by tolerance for uncertainty. Japanese commanders operated within a culture that prized precision and adherence to plan. Orders were detailed. Deviations required justification. Success was measured by how closely execution matched preparation. This system had delivered rapid victories across the Pacific and reinforced trust in centralized control. But the system assumed time to adjust. When American carriers appeared unexpectedly, then vanished, Japanese commanders faced a dilemma. Pursuit risked exposure. Ignoring them risked disruption. Each decision carried consequences not accounted for in pre-war planning. American leadership functioned differently under pressure. With communications stretched thin, authority flowed downward. Task force commanders were expected to interpret intent, not await instruction. Decisions were made with incomplete data and accepted as provisional. This autonomy produced uneven results. Some attacks failed. Some losses were avoidable. But the pace of decision-making accelerated. American forces learned faster because they were allowed to fail without halting operations. Leadership, in this phase, did not produce elegance. It produced motion. 5. Enemy miscalculation. The Japanese miscalculation was not believing the Americans were weak. It was believing they were slow. Japanese intelligence tracked American shipbuilding programs and repair facilities accurately. What it did not measure was institutional elasticity. The United States did not require full readiness to act. It required only enough capability to interfere. Every American sortie contradicted the Japanese timetable. Not decisively, not catastrophically, but persistently. The belief that the United States would wait until its forces were rebuilt shaped Japanese operational risk. Carrier groups were used aggressively, but with the expectation of limited opposition. Defensive depth lagged behind expansion. This miscalculation narrowed margins. When resistance appeared sooner than expected, Japanese commanders had fewer reserves to absorb it. The window they believed they controlled was already closing. 6. Psychological strain. Psychological strain often emerges before physical exhaustion. For Japanese forces, strain came from uncertainty creeping into what was supposed to be a predictable advance. Reports of American activity forced constant reassessment. Confidence did not vanish, but it required reinforcement. For American forces, strain came from sustained urgency. There was no expectation of safety, only survival. This produced a kind of focus that eliminated hesitation. Fear existed, but it did not delay action. The two forces moved under different internal clocks. One counted on time working in its favor. The other acted as if it did not have any. That divergence was approaching a point where belief would meet consequence, where assumptions would no longer survive contact. The confrontation that followed would not be the largest battle of the war, but it would be the one that ended in illusion. April 18, 1942. Western Pacific. Before sunrise. At 2 o'clock hours, Task Force 16 alters course into the wind. The sea is heavy, gray-black, rolling under low cloud. USS Hornet and USS Enterprise move in parallel, screened by cruisers and destroyers spread thin across open water. Radio silence holds. Every order is passed by signal lamp or messenger. On Hornet's deck, 16B, 25 Mitchell bombers sit exposed to salt spray. They do not belong here. No American Army medium bomber has ever launched from a carrier. The plan was never elegant. It was only urgent. Colonel James Doolittle stands on the bridge wing, flight jacket zipped high against the wind. Below him, Pilots wait beside aircraft with minimal fuel margins, stripped equipment, and hand-painted markings. None of them expect to land where they take off. Every calculation assumes loss. The task force is already too close. At 7:38 hours, a Japanese picket vessel, Nito Maru, breaks through the fog line. It is small, civilian in appearance, but its radio mast is active. American cruisers open fire within minutes. The ship burns and sinks, but its transmission has already gone out. The schedule collapses instantly. Admiral William Halsey receives the report without comment. He does not ask whether the enemy heard the signal. He assumes they did. He turns to Doolittle and delivers the order that seals the operation: launch immediately. The carriers are more than 600 nautical miles from Japan, 200 miles farther than planned. There is no debate. At 8:20 hours, the first B-25 begins its takeoff roll. The deck is short. The wind is marginal. The aircraft lurches, drops toward the bow, then lifts away, skimming the water before climbing into low cloud. One by one, the bombers follow, engines straining, crews focused on airspeed and nothing else. On the Japanese home islands, radar stations are not yet fully integrated. Air defense units are alert, but not alarmed. The expectation remains that any American response will come later, after months of preparation. The bombers are not detected until they are already inbound. By the time Japanese command centers receive fragmented reports of unidentified aircraft approaching from unexpected directions, the illusion has already fractured. These are not reconnaissance planes. Their altitude, formation, and timing make that clear. At 12:15 hours, the first bombs fall on Tokyo. They strike industrial districts, dockyards, fuel storage, and military facilities. Damage is limited. Casualties are relatively low. The physical destruction is not the point. What breaks is certainty. Japanese commanders scramble to understand how American bombers reached the home islands so soon after Pearl Harbor. Carrier-based aircraft are expected. Army bombers are not. The timeline they trusted no longer aligns with reality. Within minutes, alarms spread across the archipelago. Anti-aircraft fire fills the sky, late and disorganized. Fighters rise after the attackers have already passed. The raid lasts less than an hour. Its effects will last much longer. As American aircraft turn south, low on fuel, heading for China, Japanese naval staff officers begin recalculating assumptions they believed were settled. The United States was not supposed to be capable of this. Not yet. The war has not turned. But something essential has broken. The belief that time belonged to Japan alone no longer survives the day. Climax, Part 2. The Doolittle raid ends in the air, but its real impact unfolds in conference rooms. Within hours, Imperial General Headquarters demands explanations. How did American bombers reach Tokyo? Which carriers launched them? Why was the approach not detected earlier? Each question carries an implication more dangerous than the damage itself. The initial assumption that the bombers launched from carriers close to the coast drives immediate responses. Patrol zones are expanded. Defensive air cover is reinforced. But this solution creates a new problem. Carrier forces are now expected to operate farther forward, earlier, and with fewer margins for error. The American carriers themselves escape. Task Force 16 withdraws eastward at maximum speed. Japanese search aircraft fan outward, but coordination is poor. Submarines are dispatched late. The opportunity to trap Halsey's force never materializes. The carriers vanish into the Pacific as abruptly as they appeared. For Japanese planners, this is not a tactical defeat. It is something more destabilizing. The raid confirms what doctrine had denied. The United States does not require full preparation to strike strategically significant targets. It can improvise reach. It can absorb risk. It can act outside expected sequences. The response is immediate and consequential. Admiral Yamamoto accelerates plans already under discussion. If American carriers can threaten the home islands now, they must be drawn out and destroyed before their numbers grow. The solution is decisive battle, forced, not awaited. Midway becomes the focus. The operation, scheduled for later in the year, is pulled forward. The timetable compresses again. Japanese forces will seize the atoll, extend the defensive perimeter, and lure American carriers into a prepared ambush. The plan is complex, multi-layered, and unforgiving of error. It assumes that American response patterns are now predictable. They are not. What Japanese planners do not know is that American codebreakers are already reading portions of naval traffic. They do not know that American commanders are learning from every contact, refining carrier coordination under fire, and becoming more aggressive as confidence grows. The Doolittle raid has not altered American capability. It has altered Japanese perception. Psychologically, the effect is immediate. Home defense units, once peripheral, become central. Resources are diverted. Patrols are extended. Anxiety replaces certainty. For the first time, the war feels close. On the American side, the raid produces no illusion of strength. Losses in China are severe. Most of the crews will not return. The operation is acknowledged internally as a one-time strike, not a model for sustained attack. But it proves something vital. The Japanese timetable can be disrupted. That knowledge changes how American commanders think about risk. It validates forward action. It encourages pressure even when strength is limited. It confirms that initiative matters more than readiness. The collision of these lessons shapes what follows. Just weeks later, at the Coral Sea, American and Japanese carrier forces will meet without ever sighting one another directly. For the first time, a Japanese advance will be halted. It will not be destroyed, but it will be stopped. And a month after that, near Midway, the compressed timelines, the misjudged preparation, and the belief that the enemy could not act so soon will converge catastrophically. The moment Japan believed it owned, time will be lost in minutes. But that outcome is still ahead. For now, the war accelerates. The assumption that the United States had no time to prepare is no longer theoretical. It has been tested and found wanting. Aftermath, Section 1. The immediate physical damage from the April 18th raid is modest. Japanese casualty figures number in the dozens. Industrial output is interrupted briefly, not crippled. Fires are contained. Within days, factories resume operation. From a material perspective, the attack does not alter Japan's capacity to wage war. But wars are not shaped by material damage alone. Inside the Imperial Navy, the raid exposes a fracture between expectation and reality. The belief that the American homeland could be insulated by distance, at least in the early phase of war, no longer holds. Defensive planning, once secondary to offensive expansion, moves forward abruptly. Carrier doctrine is not rewritten, but it is strained. Patrol requirements expand dramatically. Aircraft previously allocated for offensive operations are reassigned to reconnaissance and home defense. Submarine picket lines are extended across vast areas of ocean, stretching crews thin. Fuel consumption rises. Operational tempo increases without corresponding increases in resources. Every adjustment carries cost. Japanese command reports acknowledge the psychological shock explicitly. The appearance of enemy bombers over Tokyo is described not as a tactical failure, but as a breach of national security. Confidence in early war invulnerability, never publicly stated but widely assumed, erodes among both civilian leadership and the military. This erosion influences strategic decision-making almost immediately. Yamamoto's insistence on forcing a decisive carrier battle gains urgency. The argument shifts from advantage to necessity. American carriers are no longer a distant future threat. They are a present danger, capable of reaching targets previously considered unreachable. The Midway operation, already complex, becomes imperative. On the American side, the aftermath is measured more quietly. The loss of aircraft and crews is severe. Of the 16 B-25s launched, none return to their carriers. Several crews are killed during crashes or capture. Others endure imprisonment and execution at the hands of Japanese forces in China. These outcomes are documented internally, but not emphasized publicly. Operationally, the raid provides data. Japanese response times are recorded. Air defense patterns are observed. The effectiveness of deception, surprise, and unconventional launch methods is assessed. The conclusions are sober. Such raids are not sustainable, but they are disruptive. More importantly, they validate American assumptions about initiative. The raid demonstrates that action, even limited, even costly, can alter enemy behavior disproportionately. It confirms that forcing reaction is itself a form of pressure. This lesson influences subsequent operations. At Coral Sea in May 1942, American commanders commit carriers despite limited intelligence and narrow margins. The battle ends indecisively in terms of losses, but decisively in terms of outcome. The Japanese advance toward Port Moresby is halted. For the first time, Japanese expansion stops not because of logistics, but because of resistance. The casualty figures from Coral Sea are comparable on both sides. Ships are damaged. Aircraft are lost. But the strategic effect favors the United States. The myth of uninterrupted momentum breaks. Japanese planners note this shift uneasily. The assumption that the enemy would not contest advances so soon has now been violated twice. Each violation forces earlier commitment of forces, tighter operational planning, and greater risk concentration. The consequences are not yet catastrophic, but they are cumulative. The cost of misjudging American time is no longer abstract. It is visible in fuel logs, sortie counts, and strained readiness reports. The war Japan expected to control through schedule and initiative is beginning to resist control. The damage, at this stage, is not to fleets. It is to certainty. By early June 1942, the consequences of the miscalculation have fully surfaced. The Imperial Japanese Navy enters the Midway operation believing it has restored control of time. The plan is elaborate, synchronized across thousands of miles, and dependent on precise sequencing. It assumes that American forces will respond slowly, that their carriers will arrive piecemeal, and that surprise can still be achieved. None of these assumptions survive contact. American codebreakers, working at Station HYPO under Commander Joseph Rockeford, have identified Midway as the target designated AF. This intelligence allows Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to concentrate his limited carrier forces, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, north of the atoll. The Japanese believe Yorktown has been sunk. It has not. On June 4, 1942, the battle unfolds in compressed chaos. Japanese carriers launch multiple waves against Midway, then scramble to rearm as reports of American carriers arrive unexpectedly. Decks are crowded with fueled aircraft, ordnance exposed, procedures disrupted by shifting priorities. The Japanese timetable collapses. At 10:20 hours, American dive bombers arrive over Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu almost simultaneously. The attacks are not coordinated by design. They converge by circumstance, delays, navigational errors, and luck. But they find the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Within minutes, 3 carriers are fatally damaged. Hiryu will strike back and cripple Yorktown, but by the end of the day, it too is destroyed. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, are lost. So are irreplaceable aircrews trained over years. The numerical exchange is not balanced. Japan loses the core of its carrier striking force. The United States loses 1 carrier. This outcome is not the result of American technological superiority alone. It is the culmination of a compressed sequence of decisions driven by an initial belief that the enemy would not be ready to act so soon. After Midway, Japanese strategy shifts from expansion to defense. Operational initiative passes permanently to the United States. The war becomes one of attrition, precisely the form Yamamoto feared. The psychological impact inside the Japanese Navy is profound. Confidence in pre-war doctrine erodes. Officers who had trusted in decisive battle and perfect timing confront a reality defined by uncertainty and loss. For the United States, Midway confirms something that began with the Doolittle raid. Speed matters. Initiative matters. Preparation does not have to be complete to be effective. The belief that the United States would need time to recover had shaped Japanese strategy from the beginning. Its collapse reshapes the war's trajectory. The timeline Japan expected to control is no longer theirs. It belongs to an opponent willing to act before the calendar says it should. Reflection/closure. The war does not always announce its turning points with fanfare. Sometimes, it whispers them in timing and tempo. The Doolittle raid, Coral Sea, Midway, taken together, demonstrate a truth far deeper than any single battle. Assumptions about an enemy's readiness are as fragile as the forces built to enforce them. Japan had relied on time itself as a weapon. They believed preparation belonged to the future, that the United States would be measured, slow, constrained. They were wrong. American forces acted in the gaps, exploiting what was present rather than waiting for what was complete. Losses were incurred. Plans were improvised. Commanders made choices without certainty, guided only by principle and audacity. That willingness to operate under pressure redefined the operational environment faster than fleets could be constructed or bases fortified. In strategic terms, the consequences were profound. Japanese expansion, once unopposed, slowed. Momentum became reversible. The decisive battles Japan had expected to fight under conditions of control were now battles in which control itself was contested. Naval doctrine, operational planning, and resource allocation all shifted in response. On a human level, the story is quieter. Exhaustion, strain, and adaptation defined the experience on both sides. Sailors, airmen, and officers were compelled to reconcile risk with action. The psychological weight of compressed timelines reshaped decision-making as much as any weapon system or ship loss. History, in this instance, did not turn on overwhelming firepower alone. It turned on perception, initiative, and the refusal to wait for preparation. The lesson endures. The rhythm of war is dictated not solely by planning, but by the courage to act within the unknown. Time, once considered Japan's ally, became the instrument of its undoing. And in the stillness that followed, the war moved irrevocably forward.